The house was perfect. It had everything she needed: spacious rooms, a lush garden, and a peaceful, quiet neighborhood. The woman Amelia had spent months searching for a place to call home, and this one seemed like a dream. The old Victorian structure stood tall with white siding that gleamed under the sun. A wrought iron gate marked the entrance to a well-kept street, its trees swaying gently as though beckoning her in. Amelia felt an undeniable connection the moment she stepped inside. The wooden floors creaked in all the right places, the windows filtered soft golden light, and the silence wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. She was finally free, free from the chaos of city life, a place to breathe. But the moment she began to settle in, a strange unease started to grow inside her. It began with the neighbours. At first they were just distant figures she saw out of the corner of her eye, always standing in their yards or on their porches, staring at her house. Every time she moved about her new home, she could feel their eyes following her. She'd glance out the window and find them standing there, motionless. Their faces were always blank, their eyes unnaturally still, as though they were watching a statue, not a living person. It unsettled her, but she tried to push the feeling aside. She'd smile when she passed them in the street, but they never smiled back. Their gazes were cold, unwavering, and intense. There was a strange air of perfection about them, too perfect. They always wore the same pristine clothes. Their movements were measured and deliberate, almost mechanical. Nothing seemed to disturb them, not even the passing of seasons. And the worst part? They never spoke, not a single word. The house itself seemed to be alive in a strange way. At night, the walls would whisper faint sounds just below the threshold of hearing. She thought it was the house settling, the wind shifting, but sometimes it felt like something else, something more. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision. At night, her dreams were plagued by images of gnarled, twisted figures, their faces indistinct but their eyes piercing and unblinking. She would wake up, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, and every time the same feeling of being watched lingered in her chest. Then one evening, after returning from a long day of errands, Amelia noticed something that set her heart racing. A slight change. The air felt heavier, as though the entire neighborhood had collectively drawn in a breath, holding it. She saw the neighbours, not just one or two, but nearly all of them. They were gathered at the edge of her property, standing in a line. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Their faces were fixed on her, unmoving, expressionless. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected the moonlight in a way that made them appear too large, too still. She couldn't look away. Something deep within her gut told her this wasn't normal, that they weren't human. The next night, she heard the whispers more clearly. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was undeniable. It was a low, guttural hum, like a chant. Her skin prickled as she tried to ignore it, but the sounds grew louder and more insistent. It seemed to pulse through the walls as if the house itself was alive and hungry. She tried to lock the windows to pull the curtains, but the sound followed her. It was coming from all directions. The neighbours were there again, standing outside, staring at her house. But this time, they weren't motionless. She watched in horror as one of them stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, his head tilted at a disturbing angle, and his arms stretched too far, too long, as though his joints were made of rubber. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only the dark, black void of an empty mouth. And his eyes, those eyes were no longer staring at her. They were staring beyond her into something that made the very air feel suffocating. The entire group shifted in unison. Their movements were erratic, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings, and the whispers grew louder, clearer. She could hear the words now, though they seemed to ripple through her mind more than in the air. "Neighbours, she doesn't belong, she will be ours." Amelia backed away from the window, trembling. She didn't know what they were or what they wanted, but the feeling of being ensnared was unmistakable. She had to leave. She had to get away. But every instinct screamed that leaving would be impossible. That night, sleep came fitfully. The whispers continued, now accompanied by soft, scratching sounds like claws against wood. The house felt like it was pulsing with life, with an intelligence far older and darker than anything she had known. The very walls seemed to breathe with a slow, terrible rhythm. And then it happened. She awoke to a cold pressure on her chest, as though something was holding her down. She gasped for air, her heart pounding, but she couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her eyes snapped open, but the room was dark, suffocatingly so. The whispering was louder now, a frantic crescendo of distorted voices that sounded like a chorus of agony. Something moved in the darkness, something massive and monstrous, crawling slowly toward her. She could feel its presence, its heat, its rancid breath, though she couldn't see it. And then the shadows seemed to warp and twist, stretching unnaturally, revealing grotesque shapes, hunched figures with distorted faces, all with eyes too large, too still. They were inside the house now. Amelia tried to scream, to push herself away, but her limbs were frozen, as if bound by some invisible force. She could feel their cold hands brushing against her skin, their fingers like ice, burning into her flesh. Her eyes darted around the room, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she saw them. Figures hunched in the corners of the room, their faces covered in shadow, but their eyes, those cold, black eyes, fixed on her. The creature above her moved closer, its elongated fingers reaching for her throat. As it did, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single, low growl. It was deep, guttural, the sound of something ancient, something wrong. Amelia's breath came in shallow gasps as the thing loomed over her, its face now visible in the dim light. A face devoid of skin, a skull with jagged teeth, its eyes black pits that swallowed everything in their gaze. And then she saw the others. They were outside, watching through the windows, standing in perfect rows like puppets awaiting their turn. Their eyes were wide, their faces twisted in unnatural grins, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The moonlight bathed them in a sickly glow as they all moved in unison, their limbs jerking and twitching like rag dolls. The creature's cold breath burned her neck, its mouth opening wider as it prepared to consume her, to pull her into the abyss. And in that moment, Amelia understood. The house, the neighbours, the perfect life, none of it was real. They had been watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down. She had never moved into a house at all. The house had chosen her, drawn her into its trap, and now it was time for her to become one of them, to join the watchers. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was their eyes, those dark, endless pits of hunger and malice, and she knew with a terrible certainty that they were always there, watching, waiting, and now she was one of them. In the quiet of the night, the whispers resumed, a low chant that echoed through the walls, soft and insistent. It was the sound of a new soul added to the collection. The house once again was perfect, for now.